There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean Breathes Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads, and I have fabulous news for you. It's still a bit tentative, but it is still fabulous news. The medication that I've been on now for 8 days or something appears to be working wonders for me, so my cough is back down to manageable, barely detectable levels. I mean, I still cough, but I don't cough any more than the average Joe of somebody that smoked for 30 years. I've been quit for 9, but, I'm back down to normal. It's no longer a problem. It's no longer interfering with my quality of life, so I am delighted. I am still a bit tentative to declare this to be over and resolved because I don't know if my cough will continue to be suppressed once the medication finishes. So stay tuned for that, but otherwise, life is beautiful in the lung department. So that's good. Thank you for all your support and concern. I'm feeling like a new man. And I don't want you to interpret that in the perverted way. Kenji's doing fine. I had a good chat with him, video chat this week, and there has been no change with his situation. In other words, his mum is still alive and in the world, and until that situation is resolved, he'll be there and I'll be here, but as soon as all that is sorted out, he'll be joining me. We can start our Canadian life together. All right, that's what I've got for an introduction this week. Let's meet this week's very interesting mystery guest. And this week's mystery guest is the Vancouver, BC writer, Christine Lai, author of Landscapes, which is a book that it's her debut, but it's getting rave reviews here, there, and everywhere. Christine, welcome to my channel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Anthony Garrett was my mystery guest some months ago, and one of the books that he recommended quite passionately was your debut novel, Landscapes, and that's why we're here. And since then, I found out so many of my other bookish friends have nothing but praise for it. So why don't we get started by you telling us about Landscapes?
Yeah, so it's, like I said, it's my debut novel, and it's mostly set in England, where I lived for about 7 years during graduate school. So in some ways, it's kind of my way of saying farewell to that period in my life. It's slightly dystopian in that it's set in an unspecified time in the future, in a time of ecological collapse. But it's really just an extension of everything that we're witnessing in the world today. So it's really not like science fiction in any sense of the word. And the protagonist, Penelope, lives inside this crumbling country estate, and she is responsible for the library and the archives. But the house is going to be demolished in a few months' time. So her job is to kind of just collect the remaining items in the collection. And as she's doing that, she's also kind of like cataloging everything and looking at the items. And that process kind of triggers a remembering process. So she kind of starts recalling certain experiences from her past. And so they're kind of episodes are kind of flashbacks to 20 years ago, when she first came to the house as an academic researcher. So she has a background in art history, and that's what she did before she became the archivist at the house. And because of that academic residency, that's how she met the owners of the house. So the previous owner, Julian, is the second main character of the book. And they have a relationship that ended in violence. So that's kind of partly what she is exploring as she is reflecting on her past, and also thinking about the future, like once the house is demolished and once she has to move on from this place that has been her home for 20 years. So that's kind of the rough framework. There are kind of different sections in the book. So the main part of the book takes the form of a diary, so Penelope's diary. So I would say 70% of the book are her diaries. And then there's a second part, which is actually Julian's narrative. And that is a third person narrative, a more kind of traditional linear narrative. And interleaved between these are essays on art history and art criticism. They reflect on, I guess, similar themes that Penelope reflects on in her section. And there are kind of these like echoes and motifs that recur throughout, even though they're obviously very different in context and also different in terms of the writing style.
That is a staggeringly ambitious debut that has, like I say, been getting rave reviews. And all kinds of bells are going off for me about some books I've read or at least know about. One is a Japanese writer, Mieko Kanai.
Oh, I love Mieko Kanai.
And what was her book that was recently translated?
Mild Vertigo. Brilliant.
Mild Vertigo, which has an art exhibition kind of essay as near the end or whatever. So that's one that the bell went off. And have you read Bear by Marian Engel?
I haven't actually, but a lot of people have been recommending that.
Well, there's nothing about climate change or anything in there, but the main character goes to this isolated old house in northern Ontario that has a valuable library, and her job is to catalog it. And then she ends up having an amorous relationship with a bear.
Oh, interesting.
Ishiguro.
Oh, yes. The Remains of the Day was definitely
The Remains of the Day, which I have not read. But so those are the books that were jumping around in my consciousness as I was hearing you describe this. And there's an awful lot about art in this book, especially maybe Turner. What is it? JMW Turner?
Yeah, JMW Turner. So Turner, I've always been obsessed with Turner, and he was actually part of my PhD thesis. So I kind of recycled some of that research. I mean, Turner, I think, has a very important place in the culture in England. So I also wanted to kind of think about how someone who has a background in art history might engage with his work, and how those paintings might speak to someone in terms of like their personal life. And I'm just fascinated by the fact that, Turner was working at a time of great change in the 19th century. So he lived to see the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And I think that a lot of those changes were reflected in his work. And looking at his paintings sometimes leads me to think about, what it means to be writing right now, or for anyone to be doing creative work at a time of great change, where the future is quite unpredictable. So there's that sense of like anxiety that I think seeps into a lot of artworks. And you can see that in his works as well. Beautiful and ethereal as they might be, I think they do express that sense of dread sometimes. Yeah.
Well, I just keep going back in my mind to the fact that this is an incredibly ambitious first novel, balancing all these things and investigating all these things and structuring with such a complex structure. In lesser hands, it would just be a failure. And I've heard nothing but praise for your novel. So how did you do that?
Well, it took a lot of time. I was working full time throughout most of the writing. So that's why it took 6 years to write. And 6 years, during 6 years, I mean, obviously interests might change, style might change. So that was quite difficult, just having to constantly go back to the manuscript and change things as my interests evolved. The 3 parts I wrote separately. Initially, they were written separately. And then during the editing and rewriting phase, I went back and started doing the weaving and linking the different sections to make sure that there are like echoes.
Why did you title your novel Landscapes?
Oh, that's a great question. I suppose because, the landscapes refer to multiple elements in the book. So there is obviously the landscape painting, which is a fictional Turner. So it's not a real Turner that I used because I was worried about issues to do with copyright and so on. So I used a fictional Turner that's kind of at the heart of the book. So the landscape refers to that landscape painting, but also landscapes refers to the natural environment. So the book addresses the ecological crisis. And it also refers to like the internal landscape of memory and of our experiences of the world. Yeah.
Well, I look forward to reading it. Actually, September on BookTube there is a readathon happening, an event where anybody who wants to can join in and read
Mm.
books on a certain topic. And in
Mm.
September, it's reading books about art. So I'm
Oh,
hoping that a
hey.
lot of people watching this will
Yeah.
select landscapes to read in
Oh,
September.
great.
Yeah. So what else would you like to tell us about yourself, Christine? Your background
Um,
or anything?
sure. I was born in Taiwan and I moved here as a child. And I stayed here until after undergrad, and I did my master's and PhD in England. Um, then I worked in Taiwan for 2 years and then came back here. So I've been here since 2015. So my background was in English literature, the Romantics, so 19th century, hence the Turner. My research is mainly about the connection between literature and architecture. So I've always been interested in like interdisciplinary discourse. So I worked in higher education before I started writing creatively. So that's most of my work experience has been in teaching. And I decided to quit my job at the beginning of the pandemic, just because it was getting really, the manuscript had gotten to a point where it was very difficult for me to work full time and try to finish it. So I just decided I was just going to quit and spend a couple months doing it and see if anyone will publish it. So, it was really perfect timing that when I quit was actually the beginning of the pandemic. So, there was really nothing for me to do except stay home and write. So it really worked out well. I don't have an MFA. The only kind of, I guess, creative writing program I did was the Writer Studio at SFU in Vancouver. And they were great. It was really insightful. It helped me in terms of just getting to know about like the publication process, because I had no idea how any of that worked. It's very different in academia, but in terms of like trade publishing, I think it's very complicated. It was really helpful to do that program. And then once the manuscript was ready, I submitted it to this prize. It's called a novel prize, and what you might have heard of it. It's run by New Directions in the States and Fitzcarraldo in the UK and Giramondo in Australia. So I was very lucky to be shortlisted for their inaugural prize, which was a huge honor. And that I think helped open some doors, helped me find an agent. And then, that's kind of how I got started. So I was very lucky to have found supportive people from the beginning. Yeah.
What a great start. What are you working on now, Christine?
I'm working on a second novel. In some ways, exploring maybe some similar themes to do with memory and images, in this case, photography. So the whole book will kind of engage with photography as an art form. And I've always found photography fascinating. And the fact that it's such a ubiquitous art form, like it's part of everybody's daily lives. And we all have smartphones, so we're all taking photos all the time. So I'm interested in kind of, in some ways, the ordinariness of it compared to something like painting or sculpture. And the book will be set in Tokyo. And
Tokyo.
Yes. Yeah, I like different locations, so I have an excuse to travel there and to do research. So I'm kind of seeing novels as like research projects. So I get to spend a couple of years reading about something that I find fascinating. So it's a great excuse.
And do you think you'll ever write a work of fiction that's set in Vancouver?
I don't know. I mean, right now I would say no, because I find distance is what gives me clarity.
Fascinating.
And because I wrote this landscapes after I left the UK. So a lot of it's based on what I once knew. I've never lived in a country estate, so that's just, imagined. I find that distance allows me to kind of like spin a web, whereas something that's too familiar and too close, I just find that I can't see it clearly. So therefore, I can't innovate in the same way. And the same goes for any kind of autobiographical content. I, have written essays that contain personal, but they're not personal essays in the traditional sense. I mean, they're not about my own experiences. So again, it's the same thing. I find the distance from experiences that are not necessarily my own gives me this ability to explore it in a different way. Yeah. So maybe once I leave Vancouver, I'll be able to write about it.
Well, I was going to say, I live in Saskatoon. It's a fair distance from Vancouver. Maybe you'll write a novel set in Saskatoon. We don't have many novels set in Saskatoon.
That's true.
Well, good luck with that. Tell us about Christine the Reader. What have you been reading recently that you'd like to recommend?
I'm a very passionate reader. I mean, reading is, for me, the greatest pleasure. I would say 90% of books I read are works in translation. And it was very difficult to choose books to recommend because there are just simply so many brilliant books. But I decided to choose two that in some ways speak to one another, even though they were written decades apart. And both are part of my current project. So they both kind of engage with photography in some ways. So Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo, which I'm sure you've heard. It's a classic of Latin American literature. And it's one that I've been curious about for a long time because I know there was a previous translation. So this is the new translation by Douglas J. Weatherford that just came out late last year, I believe. And previously, I have friends who are Spanish speakers who express misgivings about the previous translation. So that's why I didn't get around to it until now. This is a brilliant translation. And, you know, for me, this novel was really quite mind-blowing and very groundbreaking because of its treatment of time and the discontinuities of the entire work. And there's such concision. It's a very spare novel. It's quite minimalist in many ways. It's very short. So he's managed to say so much with so little. And you know, what I love are all the details as well, like the way that he describes drops of water and stones and the sky, and also the soundscape in the novel, the use of like echoes and the different sounds. And in some ways, you know, the echoes are not just like literal echoes, but also like metaphoric because of the way that the book is structured, almost like a series of echoes. The cover features a photograph by Juan Rulfo, who is also a photographer. And you know, I love his photos of rural Mexico. And in some ways, like the book conveys the same atmosphere as his photos. They're quite kind of like melancholy. You know, they show about the struggles of these rural communities that were very impoverished. So it was really interesting to look at a book of his photographs after reading Pedro Páramo.
I have one of his books sitting on my shelf, not yet read, El Llano, or In Flames.
Yes.
Have you read that one?
No, I haven't. No, this is the only one of his I've read. I want to.
I do have it on my shelf. So
yes, yeah. Well,
so he was a mid-20th century Mexican writer, right?
That's right. Yeah. And I believe this is his only novel. That's at least of the ones that have been translated into English. This edition, and I think most of the editions come with a foreword by Gabriel García Márquez, and where he talks about how much this book influenced his writing of 100 Years of Solitude, which then went on to influence Latin American literature, which in turn influenced so much contemporary fiction. So it's interesting to see that lineage as well, all the different influence there. And then there were some great reviews. There was a review in the New York Times by Valeria Luiselli, the writer, and she talks about this particular translation and what it managed to achieve. And obviously, you know, I know that translation is a difficult art, and it's often a lot is lost in translation, and the translators sometimes have to make very difficult choices. So, you know, I respect all translators and the work that they do, because without them, we wouldn't be reading all of these remarkable books.
Absolutely. And this month on Bookish social media is Women in Translation Month.
Yes.
So
yes,
I'm reading some good stuff. Yeah.
Yes, me too. So my second book is by the French writer Hervé Guibert, Ghost Image. So this is actually nonfiction, and I know a lot of people must know Susan Sontag and Roland Barthes' books on photography. This is also a book on photography, and I think underrated, not as widely read, but equally insightful. I think the main difference is that he doesn't offer it's not theoretical, so he doesn't offer like a theory about photography. He's really looking at the stories that surround specific images or specific types of photographs. So he kind of weaves these like narratives around the photos and kind of reflects on how these photos relate to his own memory and his identity. It's really beautifully written, and it actually does not contain a single photograph, which I found really interesting. But kind of part of his point is that photography is related to loss and to absence. So there's this kind of void in the book that I found really fascinating. And like Juan Rolfo, he was also a photographer. He did these really striking black and white portraits of friends, photos of interiors with objects. So there's this kind of like sense of like tenderness and melancholy in a lot of his photos that I find very moving. So I recommend this as well.
The book of his that I'm most familiar with, the English title is To the Friend Who Did Not Save My Life.
Yes.
The novel. I don't think I read it. It's
I haven't done it.
Set in the AIDS epidemic.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And yeah, that's on my reading list.
Mine too. Now, circling back to your current writing project, is there a way of writing about photographs that is kind of photographic? Is there a different style that one would apply to writing a novel that's very fixated on or focused on? Focus is a good word.
Yeah.
Focused on photographs.
It's a good question. I mean, it's something that I've been exploring. And one thing that I learned from the Guibert is that all the sections are quite short. So they're almost like snapshots. They're not fragments. They're kind of self-contained, but they're kind of like snapshots or vignettes, really, portraits of a place or a person. So I think there's something photographic in that style. And Guibert talks about Kafka's diaries, and he comments on how in some of the later entries in Kafka's diaries, Kafka describes like a street scene using, very in a very sparse way, and that those descriptions are somehow photographic. Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question, and so I hope I managed to come up with something that makes sense. And that speaks to photography as an art form.
It may well be a really silly question, but it did occur to me.
No. I think it's a great question.
I look forward to reading what you come up with. Well, Christine, thank you so much for chatting with me about all of these exciting projects. And I'm looking forward to having you back for a longer chat once I've had a chance to read Landscapes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
So, yes, those of you participating in the Framed in September readathon should consider reading Landscapes by Christine Lai. I wish I had time to fit it in. I mean, I've got one other one that I have my eye on, that I've had my eye on longer for that, so stay tuned for that announcement in a week or two. But I'm excited about the Framed in September readathon that Lindy and a whole bunch of my other favorite booktubers are involved in, or are sponsoring. In terms of Patreon news, the exciting news I have is I have new bookmarks. They just came in the mail. So this is the one with my new channel name, Sean Breeze Books, on it. Same back, different front, different books on the floor. Nothing very artistic went into the design for it, but it is, for that reason, among others, a true representation of me. So from now on, new patrons will get this one. I think I'll also send one. I've got a whole bunch of the old Sean the Bookmaniac bookmarks, so I'll probably send one of each out until the other ones are gone. And I have some new patrons from a few weeks back that I've been holding off until these were ready, and now they are. So I love the heavy. These are gorgeous bookmarks. I'm having trouble finding good bookmarks, so that's another reason to join my Patreon. These are really high quality bookmarks. They're fairly thick paper and aren't going to get bent out of shape that easily. And I don't like bookmarks with the little tassels on them. I mean, I suppose I could just cut them off, those little frilly knitted things or whatever they are. There's one bookstore in town. It's the used bookstore, Perryton Books, that have fabulous bookmarks. They're printed on the same kind of paper as this, really nice. But I miss the fact now that Book Depository is no longer with us. They used to send bookmarks in every order I placed, and so I'm if anybody wants to send me a bookmark, let me know. Anyway, other Patreon news. The winner of the draw for The Family Way by Christopher Dorado is Alina from Rotterdam, my patron. That was the random draw that I did a few days ago, so that'll go out in the mail, along with a new bookmark, Alina. And the last time I got a new patron, she said, well, I wanted to join Sean, but I didn't really know how to do it. So I'm going to get in the habit of just one sentence inserted in this section of my Friday Reads to say, if you're interested in joining my Patreon, the details are in the show notes. And I suppose there may be people not that familiar with YouTube. So where do you find my show notes? This is something I've never thought to explain. So you open the video, and then you'll see the title of the video, and then the line underneath will be how many views, how many hours ago, hashtags, and then there's a little boldface more. So if you tap that more, that's how you open the show notes. And in there, every week, in fact on every one of my videos, there are details about how to join Patreon or to otherwise support me if you wish. So there. All right. I haven't gotten any videos posted in the last week since my last Friday Reads. I've been working on editing a long video, and it's just not close to being ready. So, and also, as a segue into talking about my reading week, I've had a fabulous reading week, so I didn't prioritize video editing. I have finished 3 books. I have started 2 that I'm ready to check in on, and I'm just going to start 1 in the coming week. Let's start with the forgettable first. I read Márquez's posthumously published novel Until August, and it was awful. And this is for my novella reading project with Barb Howard, the Calgary novelist. Looking forward to chatting about this and the other novels that we are reading together. She didn't think I would like it. She didn't necessarily say she liked it, but she thought it would be a good novella to read and talk about in terms of all the issues around posthumous publication of manuscripts that the writer, before their death, didn't want published, which is the case here. And boy, did his sons and daughters, whoever they were, did they dishonor his memory by publishing this piece of you know what. So that's all I'm going to say about it. It was just... I read it, so you don't have to. In happier news, this is a book that I started reading in March, and I finally finished it. Young Bloomsbury, The Generation That Reimagined Love, Freedom, and Self-Expression by Nino Strachey, who is a grandniece of Lytton Strachey, and I enjoyed it. I didn't think it was perfect. I didn't love it, but I did enjoy it and found it very engrossing. So this is a nonfiction account of the generation after that pantheon of original Bloomsburys. Apparently they called themselves Bloomsburys, changing the spelling of bury to berry, like raspberry, and berries, Bloomsburys, Virginia Woolf and Lytton Strachey and so on. The next generation that they kind of took under their wing and brought into the fold. And this group, biography, I guess, focuses on them. And oh my God, what a bunch of libertines they were. It was dizzying how easily they fell in and out of bed with each other. I would love someday to reread it and make a family tree. Not that there were a lot of children produced from all this bed hopping, but of all the sexual connections between them, because it was just... It made it difficult to read in places because you just couldn't keep track of it. I just couldn't keep track of it. An argument could be made that the book focused on that to the detriment of delving into the artistic, intellectual, literary accomplishments of these fascinating people, but I wouldn't put too much stock in that criticism. I would see how people would feel that way, and I admit that it crossed my mind a time or two as I was reading. But no, this was well done. It gave me a new picture of Virginia Woolf and showed me more about her personality. She was could be very harsh and judgmental, but she also had a softer side. You know, she gossiped with her peers, the older Bloomsburys, about all the shenanigans of this next generation. Not that she and her generation didn't have their own shenanigans, absolutely, and those are detailed at great length in this as well. But she could be quite harsh about kind of judging gender nonconformity at times, and the promiscuity of the younger folk. But she also was quite sympathetic and gave a lot of support in terms of, you know, being a listening ear, but also like giving a lot of these young people jobs at Hogarth Press and so on. Lots of fascinating details here. Yeah, this was quite delightful. I recommend it. And on a much more serious note, earlier today I finished on audio text combo, Minor Detail by Adania Shibli, the Palestinian writer who lives in Berlin, translated from the Arabic by Elizabeth Jacquet. I'm probably one of the last people on BookTube to read it, and it was extraordinary. I don't really know how to talk about it. The first part, which is the very matter-of-fact narrative account of the capture, imprisonment, rape, and murder of a young Bedouin girl in 1949 in Israel, that's based on a true account. And then the second half is the fictionalized young female Palestinian narrator, possibly neurodiverse, some reviewers have said, and that makes a kind of sense to me. In the present day, or, you know, a few years ago, living in Ramallah, I believe, my memory is correct, who finds a one-sentence reference to this murder in a larger article about the creation of the State of Israel. And she seizes on this one detail, there's the title, Minor Detail, and wants to honor that Bedouin girl. I don't think her name was even mentioned in the article, but she goes on a quest. And going on a quest like this into Israeli archives and so on, as a Palestinian, was fraught, to say the least. And it's the tale of that ill-advised, heartrending search for more information about this atrocity amidst a sea of other atrocities perpetrated by the Israeli state against the Palestinian people and other minorities in the area. Bedouins, of course, are nomadic peoples, and there were tribes of Bedouins in parts of the area that is now colonially referred to as the State of Israel, and it was this young Bedouin girl that had been captured, raped, and murdered. It's a book that I need to reread to fully grasp. I remember thinking about halfway through the first half, this is so clinical. It's so clinical that it's almost boring before I got to the, you know, the violent part. But you soon realize what that tone is meant to express. And then the second half is a much chattier, kind of relatable tone, first person, with this Palestinian woman going on a quest to excavate and kind of rescue from history more information about this Bedouin girl. Of course, with everything going on now in Gaza, and in fact her quest takes her. In that second half of the novel, a big part of it is that she has to go out of the region, that's not the word they use, but the area, I think it's called an area, where she as a Palestinian is allowed to be in, to travel into other areas that she is not, with her pass card, not able to travel. So she borrows a friend's travel pass card to travel farther afield, and it takes her right up to the border with Gaza. And so there is military action at this time in Gaza. So it's, you know, it's all connected to what's happening now, and I don't have many more words today to express the impact this book has had on me, but it's I certainly see what all the fuss is about, and it was puzzlingly powerful. I'll leave it at that, because, like I say, I'm out of words. If you have words for how this book, Minor Detail, by Adania Shibli, affected you, I would love to read your comments, because I need some words to put to how it affected me. Powerful women in translation read. I hope you can't hear it, but there's a air blower. What do you call it? You call them snow blowers in the winter. What do they call them in the... Where are my words? Leaf blower. Okay, so those are what I finished. I have started 2. Well, I'm just going to wait a few minutes. In fact, while we're waiting, let's listen to... What's the actor's name who hates? Cate Blanchett. Here is Cate Blanchett on leaf blowers while we're waiting for this horrible sound to go away.
I don't understand leaf blowers, and I don't understand golf. But leaf blowers, if I see a leaf blower, I will... leaf blowers, I go from 0 to 1,000. I'm moving
What do you not
from
like
one
about
place to another. You blow leaves from one side of the pavement to the other side of the pavement, only for them to be blown back again, and then you go, oh, I'm going to blow them again. You need to have the wind go and blow them back in the first place. I cannot. It's all that is wrong with the human race. I could be here for 3 hours talking to you about leaf blowers. They drive me nuts. I hate them so much. The gardeners, I mean, their faces, they know that what they're doing is stupid. I'm like a barking dog, like I'm going, squirrel! If I see leaf blower, it's just, that's it. I'm gone for the rest of the afternoon. It's like, what happened to the broom? I hate leaf blowers so much.
Alright. Well, it suddenly dawned on me I could shut the window and that would take care of it, and that does take care of it. So, this was as good, if not better, than I thought it would be, and I just ran out of time, so I did not finish it. And I don't care that I didn't. It's a wonderful novel so far. The Heart in Winter by Kevin Barry. This is an Irish novel about Irish Americans set in 1891 in Butte, Montana. And Joe Smith commented on my Friday Reads last week, "You're reading a cowboy novel?" Well, it kind of is, but not really. It's not really about cowboys. But the protagonist, the male protagonist, Tom Rourke, is over from Ireland. And he takes up with a young bride who I don't think she's Irish, but she's a newlywed. She was kind of bought and comes on the train and gets married within 10 minutes, so it was all done by mail or whatever. And she marries an Irish captain. Again, Irish-American captain. Captain Harrington. But this young Tom and Polly, they fall in love, they start having an affair, and then they leave town. And they're headed, I think, for California. And against all the odds, they're not properly dressed for, it's wintertime, and there's all these adventures. But none of this is sounding too much like a Sean book, other than that the writing is gorgeous. And I often have had trouble with writers from the UK writing American stories, especially set back in history, because I find that the tone is just all wrong. Some successful examples have been Karis Davies. That was quite good. Although I'm always wondering, how would I feel if I reread that? I certainly loved it at the time. It's called West. I thought that was very successful. And Sebastian Barry's Days Without End. I think I need to reread that one. I was a little bit iffy about whether the language in that book fit America. Not that I, as a Canadian, am an expert on what would be the appropriate diction to use, but I think I recognize inappropriate diction when I read it. There may be other readers who are more qualified to make that call than I am. I freely admit that, but the writing in The Heart in Winter is really hitting me just right. And I'm kind of kicking myself that I didn't do it on audio, because I previewed it the other day on Audible, and Kevin Barry reads it, and oh my god, what a smoky, deep, gruff voice he has. It's just absolutely perfect. So those of you that haven't read it yet, preview the audio to see if you agree with me. But no, this is starting out great. I hope to have it finished in the coming week. And I am maybe a third of the way into The Leopard by Tomasi de Lampedusa, translated from the Italian by, ironically, the translator's name is more difficult to pronounce than the author's name, Archibald Colquhoun. Perhaps that's how you pronounce it. And I see what all the fuss is about. This was really difficult to get into. First of all, oh my god, the print on this edition is horrible. It's so faint. Or I don't know if it's the font or the faintness, but I gave up halfway through this section and got access to, searched for an illegal ebook version that I could read because I couldn't stand that print. I couldn't be sleepy, and I had to hold it at just the right place. And I mean, my eyes are getting to that point regardless, but with this book it was horrible. So I think I'm probably going to be relying on ebooks more and more as my eyesight fails. Anyhow, I found it hard to get into because it's set in about 1860, is it, or 1861? 1860, the spring of 1860, on the island of Sicily, and it's just before the Garibaldi army takes over Sicily, and it's the beginning of Italian unification. And I studied Italian unification as a first-year undergrad. And that would have been 1984-85, and I didn't know anything about it before, and I haven't thought about it or read about it or remembered very much about it ever since, but it is quite fascinating. So I had to do quite a bit of boning up on the history in order to get my bearings with this novel, and that was fun. If you're similarly kind of out of the loop in terms of the history and you don't enjoy that kind of Googling to get into a novel, this might not be for you, but it certainly helped me get into it. And the prince he's not like a part of the monarchy of Sicily at that time. It was the kingdom of the two Sicilies, which was basically Naples and Sicily, and it was the monarch was one of the Bourbons, so probably came from somewhere far away, like France or something. The Bourbons weren't particularly an Italian bunch. And the prince, our protagonist, he's not connected to that royal family. He's just some kind of a prince in Sicily. And he should be against the revolution that's about to overrun his country or his island. But he's secretly kind of in favor of it, and his nubile young nephew goes over to the Garibaldians, and the prince, he secretly kind of approves of it, even though he shouldn't. There is something, I guess, satirical, but I wouldn't use that word because I hate satire, but really quite funny about him, our prince. He's a bit of a lout. He goes off to the brothel after dinner with his family and takes the priest who seems to live in the palace with him. The priest doesn't accompany him right into the brothel, but he takes him into town so he could go visit his sister or something, and it kind of gives him a cover or whatever. And the relationship between the prince and this priest is freaking hilarious. And there's also serious themes about politics, revolution, class, family, but it's really quite comedic, and the writing is gorgeous. There's a scene where, after the revolution succeeds, because it was quite a quiet, in 1860, Sicily was overtaken by Garibaldi and his group, virtually without a shot being fired. Bloodless, and it just happened. There were a couple quick victories, and then it was done. And so, between the first chapter and the second chapter, that has happened. And the prince is still ensconced, like he hasn't been stripped of his stuff. Like, the purpose of Italian unification was to unite under Victor Emmanuel II. He was the first king of the unified country, and before that he'd been the king of Sardinia. And so it wasn't an anti-monarchist thing in particular, but one monarch for the whole country. But this prince, our protagonist, his position doesn't, at least so far in the novel, hasn't been threatened. So he goes to his summer castle with his entourage, and he realizes how much various class things have been kind of upended because of the revolution. So the mayor of the town where he goes is now as rich and owns as much land as the prince himself does, and that's really unnerving for him. But there's a scene between him and the same old priest that goes with him, where he tells the priest to come in, but he doesn't think the priest will come into the bathroom as fast as the priest does, and so he's standing there completely naked. And that description of all of that was one of the funniest things I've read, not in a Barbara Pym novel, in quite some time. So starting out really, really good. I'm going to have a kind of a busy week. I don't expect to get much reading done, but I am going to start a novella by Mavis Gallant. It's in this collected stories. It's the only novella, I think, that she wrote, and this is for the Barb Howard Novella Reading Club as well. It's the last thing I need to read before I'm ready to talk to her about what we've read, and it is called The Pegnitz Junction. It was published in 1973, and it was published in a short story collection by the same title, and it's novella length. It's about 65 or so pages, and I read it when I read this entire book about 7 or 8 years ago, and I'm going to read it again because I remember finding it completely captivating, but a fair amount of it went over my head, and I thought, I just need to read this again, and I'll get it, so let's see if that's true. All right, that's what I got. Thanks for watching.